Now it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this talk by Professor Carol Dougherty. Carol is a professor of classical studies and director of comparative literature at Wellesley College. Her research focuses on the intersection of history, literature, and the culture of archaic and classical Greece. Her first two books explored the transformative and tumultuous period of the 8th century BCE, a time when Greeks settled new lands, engaged in far-reaching trade networks, and embarked upon radical new experiments in politics, economics, and communication. Her book, The Poetics of Colonization, from Oxford University Press, 1993, is about the kinds of stories the Greeks told themselves about founding new colonies abroad. And The Raft of Odysseus, one moment, my pages got mixed up, from 2001, looks at the ways that Homer's Odyssey represents a culture engaged in negotiating a new place for itself in a rapidly changing world. Her most recent book, published this year, Travel and Home in Homer and Contemporary Literature, brings the Odyssey together with readings of contemporary novels like Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient and Cormac McCarthy's The Road. That are equally interested in questions of travel and homecoming. Professor Dougherty will take questions at the conclusion of her talk. Please be sure that you have turned off or silenced your cell phone, and please do not hesitate to let us know if you need an assisted listening device. Please join me in welcoming Professor Carol Dougherty of Wellesley College.
Well, thank you. I want to, first of all, thank Christopher for inviting me and Tess for all the work that I know has gone into putting conferences like this together. As a former director of Humanities Center, I know there's a lot of work that goes in behind every event like this that looks so seamless and at which people have such a great time. I'm also thrilled, as always. I'm always happy to talk about the Odyssey. So as you could probably guess. So my talk today is going to, pardon? There? Okay. What? Can you hear me now? Yes? No? What am I need to turn up? Oh, you're turning it up. All right. Are we good now? Great. Okay. So what I was going to say is my talk today is going to be completely old school. No fancy pictures, no handouts to riff through. I'm just going to tell you some stories. I'm going to tell you that good old story of the Odyssey. So sit back and relax. The translation that I'll be quoting from is Robert Fagel's throughout the translation, throughout the talk. I love Emily Wilson's new translation. I have some issues with it. Happy to talk about that. But I'll be using Robert Fagel's today, which I think also is a great translation. Odysseus, the hero of Homer's famous epic, is known for both his fantastic adventures in foreign lands and his ability to surmount overwhelming obstacles to return home safely to his wife, his son, his native Ithaca, after 10 years of war and another 10 at sea. And yet the Odyssey blurs this tidy division of travel and return, so we might also think of Odysseus as a refugee of sorts, a man searching repeatedly for escape from sea, for a new place to live, and a way to survive among alien landscapes and foreign peoples. So today I want to bring these three different readings of the Odyssey together to interrogate the reciprocal nature of travel and return, of hospitality and home, of us and them. And I propose we do it by focusing on a set of questions that Odysseus poses each time he comes ashore. What is this land I've come to now? What are these people like? While the questions remain the same, they take on a different significance in each of the three registers in which I propose we read Odysseus as a hero of travel and adventure, as a traveling man returning home to the home he left behind, and as a refugee seeking a new place to live. providing us here today with a better sense of the mutual implication of the issues this conference sets out to explore, searching for home, journeys, quests, and migrations. Homer's Odyssey introduces us to his hero as a man of many ways. Sing to me of the man muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course once he plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open seas, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all. Blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped away from sight the day of their return. Launch out on his story, muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time, too. Now, there's several things to say about this opening, not least of which is to notice that nowhere is Odysseus mentioned by name. Instead, he's introduced as a man of twists and lures, as Robert Fagles translates it, but if we want to be more literal, we'd say a man of many ways. The word here is polutropon, a compound formed from the Greek polou, meaning many, and tropos, which in Greek, as in English, means way in both senses, both literally, geographically, do you know the way home, and figuratively, how, in what way do you get there? Obviously, the poem introduces its hero as a man who's traveled a great deal. He's seen the cities of many men, as well as one whose intellect, cleverness, and ingenuity is multifaceted. And the poem links Odysseus's expansive creative intelligence to his extensive, lengthy travels. But I want to use the term polutropon here to suggest that the poem also offers us many ways to read its hero's experiences, many directions in which we as readers or listeners can launch out onto his story, so it will sing for our times as well. The Odyssey originated as an oral poem, performed and composed, reperformed, recomposed, over many years in the Archaic period. That's between the 8th to the 6th centuries BCE. An incredibly disruptive, innovative, exciting, and complex time in which Greeks were inventing and adapting much of we think of now as quintessentially Greek. The city-state, a system of writing, coinage, the Panhellenic games, the Delphic oracle. And they were doing this while traveling throughout the Mediterranean, settling colonies as far north and east as the Black Sea and as far west as the coast of Spain, and participating in a wide-ranging trade networks with the Phoenicians in the Near East and the Etruscans in the West. All this to argue that we not think about the Odyssey as a fixed and final poem, an authoritative artifact from a stable Greek past, but rather as a dynamic text with interpretive possibilities that are as many and varied as its hero. And that's the reason we keep returning to it, not because it gives us the answers, but because it helps us ask new questions. The poem itself starts in the middle, in medias res, as classicists like to say. So now that everyone knows how to say quid pro quo, you can learn how to say in medias res. And our listening or reading experience moves forward and backwards in a kind of nomadic narrative pattern that mimics Odysseus' own circuitous travels, never proceeding uniformly in one direction, always one step forward, two steps back. We learn from Athena, the goddess who shares Odysseus' qualities of intelligence and strategy, that all the other Greek heroes who traveled with Agamemnon to sack the city of Troy and bring Helen home had returned. Only Odysseus remained at sea, trying in vain to get back home to his faithful wife Penelope and his grown son Telemachus, whom he'd left as a small baby. When Zeus agrees that Athena should intervene to speed up Odysseus' return, the goddess first goes down to Ithaca, where she finds Penelope holding off the hordes of suitors with her weaving trick, again, one step forward, two steps back, and Telemachus, who's waiting to welcome a father he's never known. She encourages Telemachus to go on an adventure of his own, and we get to tag along as he visits old Nestor at Pylos and Menelaus and Helen at Sparta. And then, 4 books later, we finally meet Odysseus near the end of his journey. Athena sends Hermes to Ogygia, the island of the beautiful nymph Calypso, with whom Odysseus has spent the last 7 years, to tell her she must send our hero on his way. Odysseus builds a raft and sets sail, but after just a few days, a fierce storm sent by Poseidon shatters the raft, and it's only with great effort and a little help that Odysseus washes ashore on the island of the strange and wonderful Phaeacians. There, he's rescued by a young girl, Nausicaa, who brings him home to her father, King Alcinous, who in turn welcomes Odysseus with a generous display of hospitality. And it's here, at the court of Alcinous, that Odysseus tells the stories for which he's perhaps most famous, the stories that present him as the ultimate hero of travel, trials, and above all, adventures. So I'm going to start with just a brief recap of a reading of Odysseus as the hero of adventure. This is the Odysseus with whom we're probably the most familiar, the brave and daring hero you met as a child, as a student reading or listening to the Odyssey for the first time, captivated by the poem's thrilling accounts of shipwreck and survival after years at sea. Here, for example, is Odysseus' account of how he and his men threaded the narrow straits between a set of treacherous rocky cliffs and a powerful whirlpool, personified as Scylla and Charybdis. Now, wailing in fear, we rode up on those straits, Scylla to starboard, dreaded Charybdis off to port. Her horrible whirlpool gulping the sea surge down, down. But when she spewed it up, like a cauldron over a raging fire, all her turning depths would seethe and heave, exploding spray showering down to splatter the peaks of both crags at once. But when she swallowed the sea surge down her gaping maw, the whole abyss lay bare, and the rocks round her roared, terrible, deafening, black with sand. Bedrock showed down deep, boiling, and ashen terror gripped the men. But now, fearing death, all eyes fixed on Charybdis, Scylla snatched up 6 men from our hollow ship, the toughest, strongest hands I had, and glancing backward over the decks, searching for my crew, I could see their hands and feet already hoisted, flailing higher over my head. Look, wailing down at me, comrades riven in agony, shrieking out my name for one last time. And it's not just shipwrecks. Odysseus and his men also had to survive the very real prospect of being stranded at sea, with no wind or safe land in sight, to sail past the seductive sirens, whose high thrilling song would transfix them, lolling there in their meadow, round them heaps of corpses, rotting away, rags of skin shivering on their bones. But there's more. Once they escape challenges at sea, Odysseus and his men repeatedly face strange and often hostile inhabitants each time they make it ashore, from the fearsome Ciconians, who fought against them from chariots and on foot, to the monstrous Cyclops, whom Odysseus describes as a grim loner, dead set in his own lawless ways. Here was a piece of work, by God, a monster built like no mortal who ever supped on bread. No, like a shaggy peak, I'd say, a man-mountain rearing head and shoulders over the world. This is, of course, Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops, who proceeds to eat Odysseus' men raw, smacking them like puppies against the wall of his cave, washing down their mangled bodies with milk from his sheep and goats. And of course, let's not forget their trip to the underworld, where in addition to meeting the shades of Iliadic heroes like Agamemnon and Achilles, they encountered the ghosts of the dead and gone. Brides and unwed youths and old men who had suffered much, and girls with their tender hearts freshly scarred by sorrow, and great armies of battle dead stabbed by bronze spears, men of war still wrapped in bloody armor, thousands swarming the trench from every side. And yet it's not all bad news, not all storms at sea or monstrous cannibals. Some of the new places that Odysseus discovers are fantastic and beautiful. Some of the people that he and his men encounter are generous and kind, perhaps too kind, too welcoming, like the Lotus Eaters, who, as Odysseus explains it, had no notion of killing my companions, not at all. They simply gave them the lotus to taste instead. And any crewman who ate the lotus, the honey-sweet fruit, lost all desire to send a message back, much less return. Their only wish to linger there with the Lotus Eaters, grazing on lotus, all memory of the journey home dissolved forever. Similarly, the seductive nymphs, Calypso and Circe, even the Phaeacians, tempt Odysseus with the enticing possibilities of inhabiting fertile and exotic landscapes, with the generous hospitality of new and unfamiliar people. And we sometimes forget that amidst all the traveling for which Odysseus is famous, there's also quite a lot of staying places, making new homes. In fact, Odysseus's men have to drag him away from a very comfortable life he has with Circe after a year, and he lives with the lovely Calypso for 7. And even if by the time we meet him, he's pining for home, the poem also makes it clear that it was quite a nice place to stay. Here's how Homer describes the spacious cave where the nymph with the lovely braids had made her home. A great fire blazed on the hearth, and the smell of cedar cleanly split and sweetwood burning bright wafted a cloud of fragrance down the island. Thick, luxuriant woods grew round the cave, alders and black poplars, pungent cypress too. And round the mouth of the cavern trailed a vine laden with clusters bursting with ripe grapes. 4 springs in a row, bubbling clear and cold, running side by side, took channels left and right. Soft meadows spreading round were starred with violets, lush with beds of parsley. Why, even a deathless god who came upon that place would gaze and wonder, heart entranced with pleasure. So I'm happy to talk about this or any of these stories, and I apologize if I left out any of your favorites. But for now, let's agree that one of the many ways that Odysseus operates in the poem is as a hero of adventure, a traveling man who encounters new peoples, new places, always rising to meet whatever challenges he meets along the way. Again and again, we see Odysseus use his wits, his ingenuity, to negotiate the risks and dangers that threaten his return home. And yet all along, he's also learning new things, eager to experience different ways of life in unfamiliar places. In fact, it was his curiosity that got him into so much trouble with the Cyclops in the first place. When Odysseus and the rest of his men came ashore on a fertile island that would have provided them all the provisions they needed to continue on their journey, Odysseus refuses to leave. He wants to explore. And so he selects a few of his men and he tells them, "The rest of you stay here, my friends in arms. I'll go with my own ship and crew and probe the people living over there. What are they? Violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men?" Here, these are the questions of an adventurer, a discoverer, a man of curiosity, always eager to meet new people and learn new things. Sure, he wants to get home, but Odysseus, the man of many ways, also wants to experience everything he can in his travels, and the pleasure of the poem for us, as readers, lies precisely within that tension. The inevitable, familiar, homeward pull of the narrative is always countered, always derailed by the possibilities, the potential, the shiny newness of travel. And yet this adventurous Odysseus, whom we know and love, only appears in the stories that he himself tells in books 9 to 12, just 1/3 of the poem. Fully half of the Odyssey takes place once he's returned to his native Ithaca. And so now I want to talk about Odysseus as a hero of return. It may surprise first-time readers of the Odyssey to discover that Odysseus arrives back home at the halfway point of the poem. What possibly could be left to be told? Book 13 opens in the court of King Alcinous, where Odysseus has been regaling the Phaeacians with those escapades of daring and delight that we've just been discussing. His story is over, and while the Phaeacians sit in stunned silence, spellbound by his tales, Odysseus patiently awaits the moment when he can set sail once again. This time he hopes for Ithaca. The poet tells us that he turns his face towards the setting sun, just like a man aches for his evening meal when all day long his brace of wine-dark oxen have dragged the bolted plowshare down a fallow field. How welcome the setting sun to him, the going home to supper, yes, though his knees buckle, struggling home at last. So welcome now to Odysseus, the setting light of day. And so with this very homey and very Homeric simile, we set aside our fascination with Odysseus, the adventurous traveler, and embrace this impatient, antsy guest as eager to get home after 20 years of trials at sea as the weary farmer at the end of a long day in the fields. Odysseus awaits the Phaeacians as they prepare their magic ships, loading them with more prizes and wealth than he would have brought home from Troy. Once aboard, he falls asleep, and upon arriving at Ithaca, they carry him and his gifts ashore, hiding them safely in the cave of the nymphs. The poet then follows the Phaeacians back home, and it's not until nearly halfway through Book 13, and indeed in the middle of a line, that we return to Odysseus just as he wakes up on his native shores. That very moment, great Odysseus woke from sleep on native ground at last. He'd been away for years, but he failed to know the land. For goddess Pallas Athena, Zeus's daughter, showered mist over all, so under cover she might change his appearance head to foot, as she told him every peril he'd meet at home, to keep him from being known by wife, townsmen, friends, till the suitors paid the price for all their outrage. And so to the king himself, all Ithaca looked strange. Odysseus returns home, but he doesn't know it. His homeland looks strange. And not just because Athena disguises it, showering with mist, but also because he's been away for years. Odysseus springs to his feet, and surveying his own native country, he groans and slaps his thighs and cries in anguish once again, "Man of misery, whose land have I lit on now? What are they here? Violent, savage, lawless, or friendly to strangers, God-fearing men?" As we just saw, this was what Odysseus says each and every time he lands on foreign shores. And there we read them as the questions of the explorer, eager to learn about new places and new people. But how do they sound here once Odysseus has finally returned to his native homeland? By putting these questions in Odysseus's mouth at this point in the poem, the poet's done something interesting. He's turned Odysseus's home into someplace strange and unfamiliar, rewriting the story of his inevitable return as one that's much more complicated than we've been led to expect, as yet another encounter with what is new and unfamiliar. We thought getting home was the hard part. Now he's arrived, and he doesn't recognize his native Ithaca. His travels and the time he's been away have turned his homeland into a foreign country with unfamiliar people. This is indeed a poem of many twists and turns. Before he can figure out what to do, Athena steps in, as she often does, to help Odysseus overcome the challenges of this new adventure, this one of returning home. In addition to pouring a mist over the land so it would appear strange to Odysseus, she proceeds to disguise Odysseus as well. Athena stroked Odysseus with her wand. She shriveled the supple skin on his lithe limbs, stripped the russet curls from his head, covered his body top to toe with the wrinkled hide of an old man, and dimmed the fire in his eyes, so shining once. She turned his shirt and cloak into squalid rags, ripped and filthy, smeared with grime and soot. She flung over this the long pelt of a bounding deer, rubbed bare, and gave him a staff and a beggar's sack, torn and tattered, slung from a fraying rope. Now, Odysseus has been 10 years at war and 10 years at sea, and so I'd suggest that we read Athena's efforts here not just as a strategy to protect him from the greedy suitors, but also as the poet's way of representing to us, as well as to his family, that he's not the same man he was when he left 20 years ago. Instead, he probably looks very much like the old, shabbily dressed beggar into which Athena has transformed him. In fact, later in the poem, both Penelope and the old nurse Eurycleia say so, commenting that Odysseus, wherever he is, must be about this age and in this kind of shape. And so it's not just that Ithaca, Odysseus' native land, has changed in the 20 years he's been gone, but he has as well. And the second half of the poem attends to the heroic struggles of a man who has traveled a great deal, seen the cities of many men, and now is faced with the greatest challenge of all, how to return home again. Over the next 12 books, Odysseus reintroduces himself to the people of Ithaca. First, to his trusty swineherd Eumaeus. They exchange stories of their shared experiences of travel, displacement, and abrupt changes of fortune. Next to his son, with whom he has to forge a father-son relationship anew since he left when Telemachus was just a baby. And finally, to his wife Penelope, about whom rumors of infidelity simmer, as well as her own doubts about whether her husband will return after so many years. Does she even want him back again? And will she still love him if he does come back? And all along, the poem reminds us of the many ways that these characters have changed over time. Book 19 of the poem, my favorite book, is devoted to a long and really interesting conversation between Penelope and the still-disguised Odysseus, in which, as I like to read it, the two of them grope their way toward the possibility that Odysseus has returned, as well as the implications of that fact. Has Penelope been faithful all this time? How has she changed? What kind of man has Odysseus become in the time he's been gone? And even after Telemachus proudly announces to his mother that his father has returned and has just killed all the suitors, Penelope remains cautious, telling her husband, "You look, how well I know, the way he looked setting sail from Ithaca years ago aboard the long-oared ship." Now, the Greek here is more ambiguous than it's possible to say in English. It says, is she saying you look like you did when you went away? That is, you haven't changed in 20 years? Or is she saying you look like he did? That is, you, whoever you are, you look like Odysseus. We don't know. It's not clear she knows. And it's only the famous bed trick, when she pretends not to know that their marriage bed is rooted in the ground, that solidifies their reunion, confirming her fidelity and his identity. In addition to negotiating the rocky road of recognition and reintegration to his family, Odysseus has to face the very real challenge of the suitors, that randy and unruly group of men who've been aggressively courting his wife this past 20 years. When finally, in Book 22, Odysseus strings his famous bow, and with Athena and his son by his side, proceeds to slaughter the suitors with terrifying skill and unrelenting focus, we're confronted with the heroic fury of the battlefield brought home and squirm uncomfortably at his inability to control his rage and his need for revenge, even when the suitors beg for forgiveness and promise restitution. Indeed, Jonathan Shea and others have productively read the excessive violence that Odysseus brings into his home in light of the traumatic experience of returning war veterans now as then. And the poem itself refuses to sugarcoat Odysseus's actions. After the slaughter, Odysseus is said to be splattered with bloody filth like a lion that's devoured some ox of the field and lopes home covered with blood. His chest streaked, both jaws glistening, dripping red, a sight to strike terror. So Odysseus looked now, splattered with gore, his thighs, his fighting hands. No wonder Penelope was a little hinky about welcoming him home. And the corpses of the suitors lie piled in indiscriminate heaps in the dining room like fish that fishermen drag from the churning gray surf and looped in coiling nets and fling ashore on a sweeping hook of beach. As a result of this wholesale slaughter, an entire generation of Ithacan men, the families of the slain suitors threaten Odysseus with yet another war, this time at home. But Athena intervenes with a blanket amnesty. She literally causes the families to forget Odysseus's violence, so that Ithaca can be restored to peace, and so the poem can come to an end. And so another way to read Odysseus here is as a hero of return. If Achilles is the hero you need and want to win a war, Odysseus, the man of many ways, is the one who excels at the equally heroic challenge of returning home. And the poem elevates the skills needed to negotiate a return to rival those of fighting a war in the first place. In addition, the poem challenges the inevitability of return, the romantic notion that there's no place like home, that all you have to do is get there and everybody knows your name. As we've seen, when Odysseus finally gets home, Ithaca is as unfamiliar to him as he is to his wife and son. They don't recognize him. They don't know his name. He's just another well-traveled old beggar. And even once he and Penelope are reunited, he doesn't get to stay. He's been told that he needs to leave once again, to put an oar on his shoulder and travel inland until he meets a people who mistake it for a winnowing fan. That's a whole other problem. And so, for all the poem appears to balance Odysseus' travels with his return, to suggest that it is his travels abroad that have enabled him to return successfully to the home Penelope has been keeping, It's also the case that the poem challenges that neat and tidy dualism. For although we might argue that their famously like-minded marriage represents a comparably productive integration of the foreign into the domestic, the poem also shows us several ways that it doesn't. First, Odysseus will soon leave again. And second, as we've seen, the poem conjures its hero's return home as if it were to a new land, leaving him and us with lots of questions. What is this land? What are these people like? And so now I'd like to think a little bit about thinking about Odysseus as a hero, as a refugee hero. So in addition to reading the Odyssey as the exciting tale of Odysseus, the adventurous hero, or as a satisfyingly romantic account of his return home and reunion with Penelope, there's a third way to think about Odysseus's travels, and that is to read him as a refugee, the man who is constantly traveling in search of a new home. And in light of the recent and ever-escalating refugee crisis around the world, many have come back to Odysseus and his poem as a way of connecting to the contemporary refugee experience. From lending his name to an advocacy group, the Odysseus Network of Legal Experts in Immigration and Asylum in Europe, or to a course taught at the University of Utah called Refugee Resettlement in the U.S., Contextualizing the Odyssey of the New Americans, or to the title of a book by Patrick Kinsley, The New Odyssey, the Story of Europe's Refugee Crisis, or even to my invitation to speak at this conference here, we keep returning to Odysseus, this time as the quintessential refugee facing untold trials and tribulations in his quest to find a new home in a new land. And as part of this effort, the Odyssey is most often invoked as a way to heroize the contemporary experience, as a literary touchstone that provides enduring cultural significance and meaning to the all-too-real experiences of many displaced peoples today. Indeed, a piece by Joshua Hammer in the Smithsonian, entitled A Modern Odyssey, is peppered with quotes from the poem, comparing the daunting experiences of two Iraqi refugees, Salar and Saif, to those of Homer's many-traveled hero. Quote, Salar and Saif found themselves sitting amid 38 other refugees from all over the world, Iran, Syria, Mali, Somalia, Eritrea, Iraq, in a cyclopean cellar wrapped in near total darkness. The single light bulb was broken, a trickle of daylight pierced a window. The hours passed, no food appeared. Hammer appeals to the Odyssey not just to represent the perpetual homelessness of these two refugees, but also their homesickness. He says, Saif remained irresistibly drawn to his homeland like Odysseus, gazing toward Ithaca from the beach of Ogygia, the island where Calypso held him captive for 7 years. And he quotes the Odyssey, his eyes were perpetually wet with tears, his life draining away in homesickness. And yet others reject these romantic attempts to heroize contemporary refugees by linking their experiences with those of Odysseus, insisting that the lives of refugees here and now are precisely not like those of the Homeric hero. In her review of Patrick Kinsley's book, for example, Maya Jasanoff rejects this equation of the much more troubling outcomes of contemporary refugees with what she sees as the happy ending of the Odyssey. And I'm quoting, Kinsley points out that the migrants' journeys deserve to be considered a contemporary Odyssey. What has been unfolding on Europe's southern border certainly has the proportions of an epic, replete with heroes and monsters. But Odysseus braved the beasts while finding his way back home, and eventually he made it. These migrants have fled their homes only to be denied, more often than not, the chance of a new one. This makes this no mere Odyssey, it's a crime. And with migration season upon us again, Ithaca is nowhere in sight. So here, Jasanoff rhetorically invokes the Odyssey as a point of contrast, an idealized, romanticized fantasy against which to compare the all-too-real experiences of contemporary refugees. And yet what both these approaches fail to appreciate is the ways that we might find more in the poem than a cultural touchstone or a point of contrast. Rather, I want to argue that the poem itself is already grappling with what it means to be displaced, that Odysseus' ultimately successful return to Ithaca is carefully balanced with the pains and sufferings of that man who traveled a great distance, who suffered a great deal, trying to get home. Since we know the ending, or think we do, we tend to focus on either Odysseus' hair-raising adventures or his romantic reunion with Penelope. But the poem also locates his experiences between those two extremes, between homes. Let's return to the poem for a minute, to the place right after he leaves the cave of Calypso, with whom he's been living for 7 years, and before he settled among the Phaeacians. We find him at sea, clinging to the remains of a raft. Even though he'd taken great care to fashion a seagoing raft with materials at hand, he'd not gone far before it shattered to bits. And soon we find Odysseus struggling adrift on the heaving swells 2 nights, 2 days, quite lost. And again he saw his death. And in the passage that follows, the poet captures Odysseus' conflicting emotions and experiences in ways that are indeed uncomfortably familiar. First, he sees land, and joy, warm as the joy that children feel when they see their father's life down again, one who's slain on a sickbed racked with torment, wasting away slowly under some angry power's onslaught. Then what joy when the gods deliver him from his pains. So warm Odysseus' joy when he saw that shore, those trees, as he swam on, anxious to plant his feet on solid ground again. And yet this joy is short-lived, for just offshore, as far as a man's shout can carry, he caught the boom of a heavy surf on jagged reefs, roaring breakers crashing down on an iron-bound coast, exploding in fury, the whole sea shrouded sheets of spray. Odysseus sees no way to avoid being smashed on the rocky shores. He lunged for a reef. He seized it with both hands and clung for dear life, groaning until the giant wave surged past, and so he escaped its force. But the breaker's backwash charged into him full of fury and hurled him out to sea. Like pebbles stuck in the suckers of some octopus dragged from its lairs, so strips of skin torn from his clawing hands stuck to the rock face. A heavy sea covered him over then and there, and unlucky Odysseus would have met his fate. But he finally does make it ashore, and he lands, knees buckled, massive arms fell limp. The sea had beaten down his striving heart, his whole body swollen, brine aplenty, gushing out of his mouth and nostrils, breathless, speechless. There he lay, with only a little strength left in him. Deathly waves of exhaustion overwhelmed him now. This passage captures, in ways that are indeed now sadly very familiar, the instability of the refugee experience, juxtaposing Odysseus' fantasies of home with the very real possibility of death at sea. Indeed, a close reading of the Odyssey shows how often the poem tempers the danger of Odysseus' travels at sea with the tantalizing images and possibilities of coming home, one that's perpetually imagined through countless similes of return or rebirth, and yet over and over again delayed or deferred. After making it ashore, Odysseus makes a bed for himself in a pile of dead leaves, just like a man will bury his glowing brand in black ashes off on a lonely farmstead, no neighbors near, to keep his spark alive. No need to kindle fire from somewhere else. So great Odysseus buried himself in leaves, and Athena showered sleep upon his eyes. Earlier, as Odysseus and his men sailed away from Aeolus, the king of winds, he told us, "Our own land came into sight at last. We were so close, we could see men tending fires, only to have a storm take them away again." So without the secure knowledge of his successful return to Penelope, the hero is faced again and again with the task of making a new home, with Circe, the Phaeacians, with Calypso, suggesting a different framework for understanding the tension between travel at home in the poem. Odysseus' ultimately successful return to Ithaca is not the end of his perpetual and never-ending travels, but rather very much embedded within them. And I think we can use the points of contact between heroic past and all too real present to recognize something new that's always been there, something we may have overlooked in our traditional focus on his story as an exciting tale of adventure or a stable celebration of return. The poem is all about hospitality, xenia, that archaic Greek social institution that binds guests and hosts across time and space. The word's hard to translate. It's often rendered as guest friend and has made its way, unfortunately, into contemporary English in compounds like xenophobia, fear of strangers. But in the Homeric world, xenia is the process that turns a stranger into a friend, an institution ratified by Zeus, the god of hospitality. That means when a stranger like Odysseus arrives on your doorstep, you welcome him into your house, no questions asked. You give him food, clothes, and a place to stay. Then, should you find yourself later in his neck of the woods, you can expect the same treatment from him or from anyone of his family, now and in generations to come. This is exactly what happens when Odysseus finally does make it to shore after that shipwreck and is taken in by the Phaeacians. When he arrives at the glorious palace of Alcinous, one of the eldest lords of Phaeacia encourages the king to welcome his guest. Come, raise him up and seat the stranger now in a silver-studded chair, and tell the heralds to mix more wine for all, so we can pour out a cup to Zeus, who loves the lightning, champion of suppliants. Suppliants' rights are sacred. And let the housekeeper give our guest his supper, unstinting with her stores. And indeed, Alcinous and the Phaeacians take excellent care of Odysseus, and the poem devotes nearly 3 books to their generosity, feasting him, giving him clothes, entertainment, gifts. Alcinous even offers him his daughter's hand, the kings to the kingdom, and ultimately, of course, sends him safely home to Ithaca. The poem also offers an extreme example of the opposite, the refusal of hospitality, when Odysseus and his men arrive at the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus. And yet here, too, the encounter is framed through the rules of xenia. Once he discovers them in his cave, Polyphemus addresses Odysseus and his men. Strangers, the word here is xenoi. Who are you? Where did you sail from over the running sea lanes? And Odysseus replies that they're men of Achaia on their way home. But since we've chanced on you, we're at your knees, in hopes of a warm welcome, even a guest gift, the sort that hosts give strangers. That's the custom. Respect the gods, my friend. We're suppliants at your mercy. Zeus of the strangers guard all guests and suppliants. Strangers are sacred. Zeus will avenge their rights. To which Polyphemus retorts, strangers? You must be a fool to think I play by those rules. And instead of giving Odysseus and his men food, clothing, and a hearty meal, he makes a hearty meal of them. And the guest gift that he does offer Odysseus is to eat him last. These 2 encounters, representing xenia or hospitality as its idealized best and its terrifying worst, are fundamental to the spirit and even the structure of the poem, and suggest ways that the world of the Odyssey is also already struggling to find and negotiate the rules, customs, and practices for dealing with the consequences of mobility and displacement and relocation that characterize the Homeric world as much as it does ours today. The stories that Odysseus exchanges with the swineherd Eumaeus offer a very different view of the kinds of travels that Odysseus has had. There's no mentions of witches or monsters or magical ships here. Instead, these stories tell the experiences of a young Eumaeus who was kidnapped as a child and sold into slavery by merchants and pirates. And one of the so-called lying tales that Odysseus tells Eumaeus in return, he says he came from Crete, where as the illegitimate son, he was forced to take to sea and to war to make something of himself. These stories of abrupt change of fortune and home, tales that are set in familiar parts of the extended Mediterranean world, Egypt, Phoenicia, Crete, suggest to us a more familiar context from which to consider the poem's fascination with hospitality in the extremes, as seen in the unreal worlds of Phaeacia or among the Cyclopes. How do we as strangers find a new home? How do we as hosts turn guests into friends? And so if we return to the question that Odysseus asks each time he lands on shore, even his native shores, what land have I come to now? We can see that the poem shows how they work differently in different contexts, in different ways. In the mouth of the adventurer, they are questions of curiosity, discovery. From the perspective of someone looking for a place to live, they articulate the risks and dangers of relocation. The questions that Odysseus utters, both in the cave of the Cyclops and on the shores of Ithaca, are the questions of the stranger, the one who's looking for home. And in this way, Odysseus looks very much like Oedipus, a mythic figure famous, among other things, for not knowing where his home is. Oedipus is, like Odysseus, a man of unstinting curiosity and intelligence. He was able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. A hero who brings his need to know to bear on his own identity. For as the man who inadvertently, according to Sophocles at any rate, killed his father and slept with his mother, Oedipus has always had a complicated relationship to his home. He was exposed at birth, returned to Thebes ostensibly as a foreigner, only to be discovered to be the true native, the consequences of which led him in the end to exile himself. And so, at the end of his life, he is once again looking for a home. And in the opening lines of Sophocles' final play, Oedipus at Colonus, he arrives on stage as a blind old man, accompanied only by his daughter Antigone at the outskirts of Athens, looking for a resting place, a place to die, also a place to call home. And what are his first words? He turns to his daughter Antigone and he says, "Where are we now? What land? What city of men? Who will receive the wandering Oedipus today? Child, look, do you see some place to rest? Public grounds or groves reserved for the gods? Give me your arm and sit me down. We must find out where we are. We have come as strangers to learn from the citizens who live here." These are the same questions that Odysseus asks, and I think it's useful to think of these two mythic heroes outside their own poems and their own stories to see what they have in common, to find ways that what we know about Oedipus can enrich our reading of Odysseus and vice versa. For Odysseus, too, asks these same questions in three different registers: as adventurer, as traveler returning to the home he left behind, and also as refugee looking for a new home. They are, as we can see perhaps more clearly through the voice of Oedipus, the questions of the foreigner. Now, Bonnie Honig is a political and cultural theorist who's been thinking about the role of the foreigner in democratic politics, noting that contemporary theorists tend to approach foreignness as a problem that needs to be solved for the good of democracy. And yet, she observes that the classic texts of Western political culture often turn to the figure of the foreign founder as the one who establishes or restores political structures. And so Honig suggests, what if we flip the question around and ask not what to do about the foreigner, what should we do about them, but what questions does the foreigner help us ask ourselves? So this is where I want to focus the breakout session that follows as a way to think about the questions that Odysseus asks each time he comes ashore, to see the productive possibilities of flipping these questions of the foreigner to ask not just who is he, where is he from, but also ask questions that come from abroad. How are we supposed to respond to the foreigner's arrival? How do we answer for ourselves when faced with questions about the place we call home? But for now, let me conclude by returning to Odysseus as the man of many ways, as the one who repeatedly arrives in new lands, and also as the one who travels, seeking a new home, the hero who shows how alienating the process of return is, that there is, in fact, no place like home. Odysseus' poem offers for us, as it did for archaic Greece, many ways to imagine a productive integration of the foreigner into the home, as well as many ways to question what it means to be at home. Homer's Odyssey does more than heroize the refugee experience. It offers more than a rhetorical contrast between the romantic reunion of Odysseus and Penelope and real-life separations of migrants from their families. It provides a framework for asking the question of the foreigner. Not just what we should do with these people who keep arriving on our shores, but how does their foreignness help us claim our own humanity, our own sense of identity, our own homes? All we have to do is ask the muse to start somewhere, to sing for our time now. Thank you. Questions, comments?
I have a mic over here, and I'm happy to walk around and give it to people.
Yeah, I enjoyed how you put this together, but there's a couple other ways of thinking about Odysseus that I do. One is that he's a liar and a trickster, and the story about his magical experiences, he tells the story.
Absolutely.
And so that's suspect.
Absolutely.
And the other aspect is the gods, that they're jerking him around and everybody else, and they punish the Phoenicians for helping him. So I think it's the uncertainty of luck and life is a big piece of this too.
Absolutely. And again, I think that's what I'm trying to sort of just reorient. Hopefully it seems perfectly obvious, but to reorient the reading away from the reading of Odysseus that, oh God, he's a great adventurer, and of course he gets home, and to see that the poem is paying quite a lot of attention to the spaces in between those two places. And as for his trickery, his capacity to lie, I think that's, again, a really interesting question that we might want to take up later. How do we think about that? And in the poem, the term that is used to, the term for which Odysseus is most famous is polumatus, a man of many tricks. And that word matus is also what Athena is famous for. And I think we tend to think of lies, having, at least those of us who grew up in this country with, in the old days of I cannot tell a lie, of famous presidents who said I cannot tell a lie. Maybe we don't think that so much anymore. We tend to think of lies as morally reprehensible. And the Greek notion of matus is much more elastic, much more creative. And so I think there's another way of thinking about Odysseus's capacity for self-invention, as something that's necessary. Every time you come somewhere new, we're constantly reinventing ourselves, and he's the master at that. So I think you're absolutely right. I always laugh when people refer to the stories of witches and cannibals as those are the real stories, and refer to the ones he tells when he gets back home as the lying tales. I think, are you kidding me? Not only do we only have his word for the stories he tells to the Phaeacians, but also those are pretty crazy stories. But they're good stories, that the ones that the Phaeacians wanted to hear, or maybe they're the stories he needed to tell himself, to negotiate that kind of travel from wherever he's been to wherever he's going. Yeah.
I expect many of us have read the new book about Circe.
Okay.
And I wonder if you could comment how that fits into your understanding of Odysseus.
I will confess I have not read the new book about Circe. So are you asking me about Circe, or can you tell me how does her telling of Circe?
Well, it's basically a book about her experiences establishing herself as a single woman living on an island, putting together a life, and she having a son with a wonderful whole chapter on what it's like to deal with a howling infant.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think one of the great things about the Odyssey, obviously, is that it leaves open so many more stories to be told. And so from what I gather, I have a problem with reading some of these more contemporary retellings, but that I gather that's what Madeline Miller's doing, is really sort of stepping right into the places, the gaps that the poem leaves for us to imagine. What was it like to be for Circe to be left behind? And maybe, I think there's a Toni Morrison novel called Home, in which she has a main character who is a very Odysseus-like, and he stays with various women, and when he moves on, they're kind of relieved. At one point, the woman says, I didn't have to pick up his dirty socks anymore, and the house was clean when I got home. And I think that's, there's another possibility to think about, the lives of the stories that are not told in the Odyssey as well. It's an incredibly productive, creative poem in that way.
Hello. You mentioned the tension between trying to seek a new home among strange people versus returning to your home and the familiar customs that you know. And how do you read the Odyssey in terms of Greek society as a colonizing society that imposed its very particular way of life across the Mediterranean?
I see it very much as a poem of that world. And again, I think what is so interesting about the Odyssey is that it keeps trying to divide in half and then yet cross that boundary. So it falls right, he gets home the halfway point. And yet his arrival home is structured as if one big huge enjambment across that divide, and it's just one more trip. So I think I had written earlier about thinking about the Odyssey as, in fact, a kind of founding poem and as a poem that is seeing the act of change or sort of using the language of refounding as a way to understand a new world and finding a new place in it. I think so I think it's very much a response to that, to the world in which people are moving around all the time and encountering new peoples all the time. I guess I also am coming to think about it now from this point of view of sort of thinking about the way that focusing on, it's not just that Odysseus is coming home to a new world that he has to figure out what to do with and refound, as it were, as a result of his experiences abroad, but he's coming home as a foreigner. So what does that mean? It's not just the case that he's coming to a place that looks strange to him, but he's coming in the role of an outsider. So is that another way where the poem is trying to sort of defang this tension of us and them, or get us to at least experience both sides of that question? I don't think there's an easy answer. But I think the poem is, you can see that it's wrestling with those questions. What it means to live somewhere else, what it means for other people to live with you. Exactly. You had a question?
I have read Madeline Miller's book, and she repeatedly refers to Circe as a nymph.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Okay, I'll speak.
No, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Madeline Miller in that novel sees Circe as a nymph, which is the word that Homer uses for Calypso repeatedly, and you referred to Circe as a nymph too, but Homer, most of the time, like at least 10 times, he calls her a goddess. And I'm really interested in your take on that, especially since you wrote a book about the 8th century. You're very familiar with Homer's time and before Homer's time too. So I'd love to know what connections you make there. And then one other comment. I'm very interested in all the violence at home at Ithaca, so I hope somebody else asks you about that. Okay.
So I guess I'm not sure what your question is about. Is the question, can Circe be a nymph and a goddess at the same time?
Not so much that. He calls her a nymph once, but the goddess references are at least 10 times, I think more than 10 times. And why do you think he uses goddess instead of nymph? I guess that's it.
I have a kind of an unorthodox take on the gods in the Odyssey, which is, and maybe this gets to the first question as well, which is that they function as more rhetorically than as a reflection of religious practice. So that, I think one of the things that's really difficult for us is so the Greek divine system was a system of many gods, not a system in which gods are object of worship, but are also characters in stories. And it is the case that Zeus and Poseidon and Athena were also the same gods that you would go to a temple to worship and had cults and practices. The Odyssey is not a poem that codifies that religion in the same way that the Bible or the Quran does. So I think for me, the way that gods work is as narrative superheroes, as narrative characters that allow the poet to transcend time in different ways, to move, to express time and the relationship of that boundary between what it is that a human can do and what a god can do. So I don't think that to represent Circe as a god is to represent her as strange and powerful. from my point of view. Not necessarily anything at odds with the fact that she is unmarried, which is sort of what being a nymph means. That's both those two things are being put together. I don't know if that's terribly unsatisfying. My students, I think, find it unsatisfying also, but I keep trying.
Okay. Oh,
And violence, you wanted to talk about the violence?
yes, especially the hanging of the maidservants.
He's not a nice guy. He's not a nice guy. No, exactly. And I think that's something that also we like to overlook but and it's not just that we are finding something that's important to us and kind of retrojecting it into an old poem. It's there in the poem. As the similes that I read to you, there's no dancing around the bush there. He is a violent, scary guy. He's bringing the war from Troy into the house. That's not okay. And the suitors, and the fact that the suitors say, we didn't know it was you. No harm, no foul. You can have her back. We'll pay you back. No problem. And he still represents that. He still keeps going. I think is something to think about, as well as, and this again, I have this passage for us to look at in the breakout section. The suitors say at one point, no one could blame you for your anger. So it's interesting. These poems don't have easy answers. They don't sugarcoat the anger. They don't give you answers for it either. I think they allow us to sit uncomfortably with the necessity and the necessity for violence, the place of violence in the world, and our failure to think about how to erase that. But we certainly talk about that more. Yes?
I'm interested in the question of Polyphemus and Xenia and the complexity of how Odysseus, I think maybe I'm hearkening back to the colonizing question, how Odysseus first presupposes that he's going to receive a welcome, in that he walks into this cave, helps himself to the cheese, says, this is great, let's feast a little bit, but then let's hang around and ask for what we've already stolen. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about Odysseus as somebody who both honors and also breaks Xenia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Right, and I think we could think about Xenia or hospitality as a structure that is being brought to bear on the experience or the practice of colonization as well, and perhaps this is a better answer to the first question, which again is not perfect. And so I think you're absolutely right. He is, again, just as he does at home, he's not a model guy, and he does take what isn't his, the other thing that's interesting is in his act of violence, which is easy to, on the one hand, to say, oh, isn't he clever? He tricked him with the name, and he managed to make the pointy spear into a stick and poke him in the eyeball. But that there again, I think the real power of the Odyssey is in the similes. Those similes are all similes that are drawn from the world of technology, and I think they represent, on the one hand, you're cheering for Odysseus to get away from this cannibal monster, but at the same time, you're kind of uncomfortable with the way that practice is described as a violent imposition of technology on native peoples. A guy who was minding his own business, taking care of his sheep and goats, and somebody just showed up and took all his stuff. So I think both things are there. I think we have not been interested in reading them that well. So when he pokes out the eye of the Cyclops, the sound of his sizzling in his eyeballs is compared to the sound of a blacksmith who's tempering his metal in hot in water. So the stick itself is described. Making the stick point is described as the work of a shipwright. So there's a lot of appeal to technology. Again, in a kind of problematic way. So, yeah, I think you can think about, I think that, and, the question of is Polyphemus human or not? Certainly later poetic traditions turn him into the lovable, forlorn. All my Latin teachers out here will know him from Polyphemus singing his idyll to, the poor lover that nobody loves because he's this ugly guy. And there's a little hint of it in the Odyssey when he's so sweet with his little ram. And the ram's trying to leaves last because he's weighed down by Odysseus underneath. And he says, "Oh, you little ram, you must be looking out for me." So I think there's ways in which we also can see that monster is not, he does eat the men raw, but he also cares for his sheep, and there's, it's not an easy characterization. Yeah. Yes?
Hi. So I wanted to ask if you could say some more about
Okay. Sorry, I didn't see where you're coming from. Okay, gotcha.
About Emily Wilson's translation. I read it a few years ago, and I was really struck with how incredibly readable it seemed to be. And you said you had some problems with it.
Well, they're the annoying problems of a Homerist. I think it's a engaging translation. I think it's great because it's gotten so many more people to read the Odyssey. I think her being very overt about the sexist assumptions that have gone into many male translations of the Odyssey up to this point, and the ways in which they have read those slave women who get hanged as whores instead of just being slaves. I think those are all great. She just, for me, I like to be able to find the Greek in the translation, and sometimes she takes liberties. And in fact, she has said that she, as a point of principle as a translator, she likes to pick the jarring, unusual word. So, for example, her translation of that opening is "Tell me about a complicated man," instead of "the man of many ways." So alluding to Facebook, it's complicated, which I think is okay. It's a strategy, but that's my issue, is that it. I don't always agree with that, but that's why we have lots of translations, so that everybody can find different things in it. Yeah.
I had a slightly different reading on the Odyssey that I like when you were comparing Oedipus to Odysseus as truth seekers. I don't really get a sense that Odysseus is a truth seeker. When he asks all those questions when he arrives at a land, he's just trying to figure out how he can take advantage of the inhabitants. I don't think he's interested in truth at all. And then when we
Well,
get
he's interested in knowledge, right?
I'm sorry?
He's interested in knowledge. He's a curious guy, Odysseus.
Oh, he's curious, but
Yeah.
only to the point of taking advantage of and getting what he can from the land. And isn't Polyphemus absolutely right when he says that Odysseus, he doesn't trust Odysseus, he sees that he's a liar, and he's very worried that he's going to be taken advantage of and be killed?
And he is, yes.
Yes, but I mean, I don't think that's a lack of hospitality. I think that's being very perceptive.
Well, but Polyphemus actually does use that language of hospitality, and he says, I don't play by those rules. He says, I don't care about those gods. I'm not going to do Xenia. So I think you're right in both cases. I think, and again, you're right, Odysseus is a liar. You can read that, and certainly as if you read any Greek tragedy, the character of Odysseus in Greek tragedy as a corrupt morally, a guy who's willing, a sophist, a guy who's willing to say anything at any time to rabble-rouse and cause trouble. I think he's more complicated in the Odyssey.
Oh, I know.
And the lying, again, I guess I keep coming back to the way we only see lying in a negative, deceptive way.
Oh,
and
but
that I think,
Polyphemus is worrying about getting killed. It's not some abstract sense of lying.
right, well, okay.
And
yeah.
then I wanted to, I mean, and also when Odysseus kills all the suitors, I can see that. I think it says that he's worried that if he leaves any of these people alive, they're going to come back, and even though they say they're not going to seek revenge, just given that society, there's no reason to believe that they're not going to seek revenge on him
Oh,
one way or
he has every right to be worried, and and they have every right to be upset.
Sure.
Not only did he kill everybody who was in that dining room, he didn't bring any of his men home. Right? So I think that they have every reason to be upset with him as much as he has every reason to be worried about whether he'll still be able to be in charge. And that's, again, part of what that poem is showing how hard that is. You can't just, as Agamemnon found out all too well, you can't just walk in and say, "Hi, honey, I'm home," and it'll be fine, right? You have to work for it. So I think that's part of what the Odyssey is showing, is how you have to work for it. Yeah. Yes.
I wonder if you could talk about the contrast between the merchant and the warrior as two ways of being. Coming out of the Dark Ages, there's a renewal of trade, which requires a renewed kind of stability and order. But Odysseus is a warrior, and he's one of the epithets that's repeated is that he's a sacker of cities. In fact, even after he gets home, he goes and sacks some cities in order to make up for what he lost on the way. And when he's in the land of the Phaeacians and they're trying to entertain him with sports, and he declines the offer to throw the discus, and someone says, some young wise guy says, I figured as much. You're probably a trade wandering merchant rather than a warrior. I mean, nothing seems like it could make Odysseus so mad, but it seems like the warriors are completely at odds in destabilizing society, in sacking cities rather than engaging in trade that's kind of good for everyone. So there seems like a tension that's running there.
Absolutely. And I think that there are lots of, so again, this poem is the product of a world in which people are sailing around a lot, encountering new people and exchanging, participating in these trade networks, and also engaged in warfare. And where all those different practices overlap is, I think, again, at the heart of the poem. And there are many ways in which the poem, when people show up, it's like, how did you get here? Like, what's the means for which what's your purpose for getting here? And often, are you a trader or a pirate, right? That's like not the good way to be doing it. And again, I think this goes back to hospitality. I think one of the other ways that hospitality is working in this poem, in addition to negotiating new ways to live in new lands, also has to do with the transfer of goods around the world, economics. That in the good old Iliadic days, you had a stable, aristocratic body of people who knew each other and who exchanged. So it wasn't just about putting people up and giving them a place to stay, but it was also about exchanging of gifts. And so the Iliad and the Odyssey are full of all these gold cups that were transferred in gifts that people gave. And I think that part of what's going on in the Odyssey as well is a crisis over value. If you're now trading with people you don't know, how do you know what something's worth if you don't have this established system of your grandfather gave me this really pretty gold cup, and so I'm going to give you this beautiful silver sword, and then you're always working in the symbolic language of metals and in a stable aristocratic network. All of a sudden now you're trading with people you don't know who they are, they're a different cultural, different language, and I don't know how much is that bucket of wine worth, or jug of wine worth. Is it worth, you're having to, I think part of what the poem is taking on also is how do we decide what things are worth. So the other interesting thing, so that when he's at the Phaeacians, and yes, the young guy says, "You don't look like an athlete. You look like a ratty old trader." And so I think it is, again, there is a kind of class thing that's going on. But also what Alcinous says, when Odysseus finishes his story, or he tries to stop halfway through the underworld, he tries to stop, and Alcinous says, no, keep on going. But he says, your stories you don't sound like a thief or a merchant when you tell stories. Your stories have enduring value and shape and beauty. And so I think that part of what's going, there's so much about the Odyssey is about instability of mobility, or the instability that comes from mobility and things not being in sure places, and that has to do with economics, that has to do with where people live, and it has to do also with literature and poetry, and like how you know what's a good song or not. And so much of I think the Odyssey is sort of exploring that destabilizing effect of mobility on all those different registers as well. So trade, in addition to settlement and colonization, in addition to what makes how do you know what's a good story, is also on the table. Hi.
I think it's very interesting how you are comparing Oedipus to Odysseus in some ways. One possible interpretation of Oedipus' name is I've come to know my limitations. And I'm wondering, thinking about Odysseus, who seems so full of himself and telling those heroic, nearly incredible stories about what he's done and overcome, are there some times when he talks about his own limitations and when he sees where he falls short? If you could talk about that a little bit.
I don't know that he ever does. And that would be the difference. That there's a story that could be told there, but I don't think I can think of a time. Maybe let me mull it over. I'm currently working on the Antigone, and so I've been, and also Oedipus at Colonus, and so I was rereading that play, and I thought, oh my, that's just what Odysseus, and at the same time I'm putting this together, and I thought, that's just what Odysseus says. So I feel like there is an interesting way in which Sophocles in 401 is putting into the mouth of Oedipus the questions that are most famously associated with Odysseus in a way that maybe makes us think about Oedipus differently. To say, well, maybe what he's, there's a way in thinking about, we don't just have to focus on the fact that he slept with his mother and killed his father. We can focus on the way that he is always looking for a place to live. And by making him sound like Odysseus, we're taking that character and giving him that kind of heroic value and saying it is a hard thing to look for a place to live, right? And then also, it obviously makes the Athenians look really great to be the ones who say, sure, Oedipus, we don't care you slept with your mother and killed your father. Come, we'll give you a home. So there's all kinds of interesting things going on there. But then I think it also, this is what I love about how these mythic types can continue to generate itself. So I think, and we don't have to be bound by chronology. I think then once we see what Sophocles has done with his Oedipus by virtue of making him look like Odysseus, I think you can go back to Homer's Odyssey and say, no, wait a minute, it's not all, there's a poignancy to what Odysseus has to do all the time too, and he's constantly having to look for a new place to live. And he too is a old guy, a person at the end of his life who's seen a lot of things. And so it's a really, I think, I kind of mutually, I don't think they match perfectly. And so back to I think in many ways Odysseus is about a kind of knowledge and external guy who wants to know the outside world. And as with everything else, Oedipus is all about himself. It's all internal. There's too much sameness. So there are ways in which their love of knowledge is obviously different. But so I'm not trying to make them identical, but I just think it's kind of a useful exercise to see in ways in which they are similar, to see that I think that's what Sophocles is probably doing. It's sort of trying to return at the end of his life to Oedipus, a hero that he'd written about 3 times already, and maybe see something different there.
Thank you. I think we're just about at the end of our time. So I want to thank Professor Dougherty for being here this morning.